this is, well, every speaker that we've had, it's just been such an honor and such a joy to have all of you. Jerry, it is a huge honor to have your presentation as well. So many of us look up to you and have known your work for some time. When I had to look up Jerry's publications, I didn't really know where to begin because the list was so incredibly long, not only on Roger Bacon, but also on Bacon in conversation with other major medieval thinkers, Robert Grosseteste among them, John Peckham, Aristotle, and I noticed especially that these two major volumes that you produced, Roger Bacon and Aristotelianism and Roger Bacon and the Sciences, but also you work more broadly. You have the Brill edition companion to Meister Eckhart. You do some work on contemporary philosophy as well and its relation to the sciences. So it's just so wonderful to have you here, Jerry, emeritus professor at the University of South Carolina. And I don't want to take any more of your time, Jerry. So please let me hand it over to you. We've got Jerry's most recent handout has come around just last night, depending on what time zone you're in. So please refer to that one, and we'll let Jerry get on his way. Please.
Folks, my apology for that first handout. I have difficulties with my eyes, and it was a difficult time doing the handout. Now, as you see from the handout, there are 7 parts to the paper. I'll begin with the first. Sometime between 1267 and 1268, Bacon sent his favorite student John with his works, especially the Opus Maius, to the Pope. He also offers a rationale. He talks about the youth who for 5 or 6 years he's instructed in languages, mathematics, and optics or perspective, in which is all the difficulty of those things that I sent. I've instructed him freely after I received your first mandate. That is the mandate that Bacon got from Cardinal Guy Le Gros de Fulques in 1262. Now, Bacon talks about this John explaining to the Pope and his advisors, according to the modum, the method that I hold. And the other teachers, including the Magister Magnus, now, any of those I've mentioned earlier in the Opus Tertium, they include, of course, Albertus Magnus and William of Sherwood, about whom he says, that is Albert and William of Sherwood, cognosco enim eorum sapientiam optime. What were Bacon's tasks in the Franciscan Studium from roughly 1256 to 1266 when he writes the Opus Maius? He complains about not having time to write an Opus Principale. In the Opus Minus, page 328 to 30 of Brewer, he talks about the sins of the masters of the sentences. And he complains of the fact that they can choose the hours to teach, can have assistants, and can have rooms in the Franciscan Studium. And those who read the Bible have to beg for those hours of teaching and have to follow the wishes of the masters of the sentences. Elsewhere, the masters of the sentences dispute and are held as masters. He then says that the ancient authors, and then the recent ancient sapientes antiqui, such as Grosseteste and Adam Marsh, used the biblical text. That Alexander of Hales was the first who taught, and then taught the sentences just like the Peter Camester's work on the histories had been taught. Now, Bacon goes on to list topics from the Opus Maius that he wants to address, and they include the triune God, creation, incarnation, antichrist, immortality, resurrection, happiness of the next life, and misery of the next life. These are Bacon's, as it were, 6 principles. Now, for evidence of what Bacon was doing in the Franciscan house between 1267 and 57 and 66, it's clear from Opus Tertium, page 65, that he was studious. He was doing some kind of study. Recently, the paper by Benoit Grevin and others, published in 2001 in the Archive, on the notes in the Toulouse Bibliothèque Municipale Manuscript 402 and Florence Laurentianum, PL 25 Codex 4, deal with the matter on the meaning of biblical words, and they are related to Bacon's Opus Tertium and the second half of the Compendium Studiae Philosophiae. These manuscripts contain a Latin, Greek, and Hebrew glossary, notes, and correspondence. These notes are attributed to Bacon and are dated between 1257 and 1263. Further evidence is presented by these authors that Bacon worked in the Franciscan Studium on the Franciscan correction of the biblical text with William of Mara, and had some connection with Gerard of Hugh. This activity was a duty. I'm grateful to Professor Rosier Katash for providing us with this information in her first talk to the Roger Bacon Research Society recently. Now, about Bacon's metaphysics. Bacon, as we know from the work of Silvia Donati, the status of the metaphysics in the early work is problematic. She has excluded Physics 1.4, Questions on Metaphysics 11, and Questions on Metaphysics 1.4, thus leaving only one book, Fascicule 13, the Questiones super prima Philosophia Aristotelis, as the only authentic Bacon work on metaphysics from the 1240s, which means that many studies from Theodore Crowley to Pierre Antelich to Luca Bianchi and others have to be changed. The latter has already indicated in an article these changes. The broad conclusion: the influence of Avicenna's Liber de Philosophia Prima is definitely there in early Bacon, as is Gundesalinus, Solomon ibn Gabirol, and the Latin authors from Boethius on. Now, a question. Did the later Roger Bacon, after 1263, did he write a new and later work on metaphysics in the period 1260 to 1269? There is evidence for the fact that he did, and it is found mainly in the Communia Mathematica. There's not time to review all of this material I've given you. You can read it at your leisure. I will just refer to some references and move on. Et hoc manifestavi in metaphysica mea. Declaravi quidem in metaphysica quod mathematica dicitur duplicitur, et de his in metaphysica certificatum est, quantum et eam pertinent, etc. Et in ex metaphysica mea, etc. Now, one of the things in what follows is the importance that Bacon gives to what he calls the Philosophantes Christiani. These start with Boethius and Cassiodorus, and important here is the praise in Cassiodorus and the need for the use of mathematics in philosophy, and so forth. And at the bottom of the page, my page says, and often in my metaphysics, I have demonstrated specifically that the metaphysics of the Christians should complete the work of the infidel philosophers and extend them to greater lengths, etc., etc. He praises the Liber Demonstrationis, and he links logic with rhetoric and poetics. And this is very important for the moral philosophy, but also for even in book 3 on languages in the Opus Maius. He then says at the end of one passage, et iam composui de eo tractatum in logicalibus. Now, what is he talking about? I think he's referring to Opus Maius 7, part 5 of the moral philosophy, again on the nature of the rhetoric and poetics of Aristotle as a part of logic. And he's also referring to the De Signis in part 3, the one edited by the great Jan Pinberg and his students, and translated by Maloney, and also the discussion of equivocation, ambiguity, and analogy in the Compendium Studii Theologia, books 1 and 2, edited by Maloney. We have just one manuscript copy from the late 13th century of that work, but the content of the work is closely related to Bacon's concerns in the 1260s, and probably originally was written then. More recently, in a forthcoming paper on 2 new versions of Bacon's Perspectiva, the first is Bacon's teaching text prior to the Opus Maius. The Opus Maius text is the one edited by Lindbergh. And the other text is a fragment of part 5 of the Compendium Studii Theologiae, found in London manuscript MS 7F, 8, folios 3 or 12 . I am in the process of editing both texts. Now, I'm going to ignore the passage that follows that, the long passage, and I'm simply going to go to Bacon's definition of metaphysics in the Communium Naturalium, where he says, postquam tradidi grammatica et logicalia, and so forth. Bacon seems to have divided his work into grammar and logic, natural philosophy, and then metaphysics plus morals, which, you know, roughly coheres with the traditional Platonic Stoic division of philosophy, which runs right through the Opus Maius. What then can we conclude about Bacon's new metaphysics? The Opus Maius, Minus, and Tertium are the first draft of his new Metaphysica, a kind of new Summa Sapientiale. The Opus Tertium in particular is the prepared research grant to the Pope so that he could finish this work. I guess the Pope did not send him any money. It is an account of, in Bacon, of the metaphysics of linguistic and mathematical sciences, together with natural and metaphysical treatment of other topics such as matter and form, universals, particulars, causation, time, place, generation, and a short De Anima section in the Communia Naturalium. Since Bacon did not complete his great work, we have to reconstruct Bacon's metaphysics from the works that we have that have come down to us. Now, I want to turn now to the structure of the Opus Maius. In particular, part 3 to part 7. Each part is based on a Muslim author whose work is integrated with traditional Christian sources. It's important to note that the architecture of the Opus Maius is borrowed from Alfarabi's De Scientiis, although Bacon, as it were, overturns Alfarabi's primacy of philosophy over religion. From parts 3 to the 7, all dealing in some sense with the study of languages and the application of mathematics, even in morals, each part depends on the work of a major Muslim thinker. In part 3, the importance of Alfarabi's De Scientiis on rhetoric and poetics. In part 4, in the physics section, the use of Alhazen and also Abu Mashar on astrology. Parts 5 and 6, in the Perspectiva, influenced, of course, by Alhazen. Parts 6 uses Al-Ghazali for spiritual experience. And in part 7, Avicenna is central to Bacon's part 1, 2, and 4, as indeed is Abu Mashar. Now, I've had the privilege of seeing a new study by Teresa and Druart on Bacon's use of Avicenna, and I will simply give you the summary, bare summary. This general sketch, she suggests, that Bacon does not do exegesis. Tentative conclusion. Does he treat the other sources as casually as he treats Avicenna? Yes, he knows his source in Avicenna quite well, but he pays no attention to context or to the intention of the author, and he manipulates the text for his own purposes. I tend to agree with that. Now we turn to the Latin authors and the Greek authors used by Bacon, but first Bacon's rationale for using them. I make these statements because some others try to obscure our Catholic teachings found in the books of the philosophers, but we should gladly receive them in testimony of our faith, especially as it is certain that these men learned their teachings through a revelation made to them and to the holy patriarchs and philosophers, as was shown above. That is, the ancient philosophers had a general revelation also. Bacon treats ancient philosophers and Muslim philosophers as persons of wisdom. He bases much of his account of the Platonists on Porphyry as presented by Augustine in the Civitate Dei, Apuleius, the De Socrates, but especially the De Platone, Book 3, the very useful summary of the major works of Plato. And on the Platonic texts, namely Meno, Phaedo, part of the Timaeus, and the commentary of Chalcidius. These are supplemented by Seneca, Cicero, Hermes Trismegistus, Ethicus Ister, and others. Among others, one finds brief references to two important Greek philosophers and theologians. These are just brief, bare references, but they tell a story. The first reference is to Pseudo-Denis, and the second, for our purposes, more important reference is on page 57 of the Opus Maius, Part 1, Bridges Edition, Volume 3, and it may be quite important because it witnesses to a mixing of Greek and Latin theological traditions in Bacon. It is an important reference with many cross-references throughout Bacon's works. And I quote it. It is about the sons of Noah and Abraham, who were the first expert astronomers. Ut Josephus narrat, et Isidorus in tertio libro, et Clemens in libro primo. This reference to Clemens is to the book 1 of Clement of Alexandria's Stromata. The latter work is so important for the manner in which it adopts a Platonic understanding of science and philosophy and takes up and transcends Aristotle and the Stoics. In the light of new research of Fiorella Ritucci that we've just now seen on Thomas of York, it is most likely that Bacon had the access to the Summa Sapientiale before he wrote the Opus Maius. In the context then of Bacon's Perspectiva, however, two other ancient sources, one a Gentile and the other a Christian, are very important. They are Ptolemy and Augustine. Both enable Bacon to correct the teachings of Alhazen, Avicenna, on the text concerning the intromission and extromission of race. And it enables Bacon to construct his own peculiar synthesis of perspectival knowledge. And as is becoming clear from the research of Cecilia Panti, the keys to this move for Bacon's part are the works of Robert Grosseteste on the sciences and on optics. It is well known that Bacon used Ptolemy, for his used Ptolemy's optics. What is not so well known is the methodological role that the introduction to the Almagest plays in Bacon's new method. Already, Grosseteste himself had used the same source. Bacon sees Alhazen as needing correction, and he does so by means of Ptolemy and by means of Augustine de Musica, Book 6, who asserts that the species of the eye is engendered in the air as far as the object. Before I proceed to the texts of Ptolemy and Augustine, I want to acknowledge the judgment of David C. Lindbergh and Mark Smith on this matter. David C. Lindbergh points out that Bacon's visual species are not old-fashioned Platonic light going out from the eye and pulling back from the object. He makes the point, Bacon was acute enough to notice that Alhazen, Avicenna, and Averroes had never disproved the existence of visual radiation. They had, according to him, merely demonstrated the absurdity of something material passing from the eye to the visible object, seizing it and returning. Mark Smith, agreeing with Lindbergh, says, for another thing, in the absence of visual radiation, sight would be reduced to pure passivity. Having the eye cooperate actively in the visual process makes the process intentional, or as Augustine would have it, attentional. What then are visual rays for Bacon? They are extensions of the perceiving, knowing subject. His two sources, that of the introduction to the Almagest and De Musica, are interesting in this respect. In the latter, Bacon uses Ptolemy to say that Aristotle does not sufficiently use mathematics in either physics or metaphysics. And in De Musica, he quotes from Augustine that the diffusion of rays shining out from the small pupils of the eye assist us in measuring the spaces of places. Now, in the light of these sources, then, what for Bacon are visual rays? They are geometrical measuring lines that enables us to certify visually the object and its proper location. When we use our complete perceptual process, that is visus, comparison, and knowledge by syllogism. The latter is instantaneous intuition of singular object brought about by very fast and insensible inferences. There is more to this at the physical level, since reason and experience are mutually united. And Bacon spells that out, crosses out in the second half of the Perspectiva. I come now to an issue of the relationship of the Perspectiva to Bacon's account of intellectual knowledge, part 5. In the same text of the Moralis Philosophia, where Bacon comes to present an account of the immortality of the soul, having reviewed Avicenna, Aristotle, Cicero, Varro, and Porphyry, he stresses the essential unity of soul and body. For Bacon, the human being is a unity, although a complex unity. See the text you have, Moralis Philosophia ad Massa, part 1, pages 23 to 24. And I'll just go to the middle and say, and therefore the happiness of the human being is the happiness of the conjunct. Therefore, they do not place a soul in the body, but a true composite of soul and body. And not that its essence is a soul alone in a body. And in other words, then, he's drawing on Avicenna at this point. Whether he's getting Avicenna right is another question. But what I want to emphasize is Bacon is convinced that there is one single human being, a composite, and not two substances, not two separate substances. Bacon uses in this Communia Naturalium Distinctio Tertia de Anima, can be seen as a key to understanding his overall account of perception in the Perspectiva. And he says in the Communia Naturalium that he deliberately constructed the Perspectiva to do a critique of the natural philosophers, the experts on medicine, etc., and the philosophers. Having dealt with natural multiplication of species in the particular senses, the common sense and the imagination, Bacon notes that we need a far more powerful and nobler power of the sensitive soul for judgments of insensate species coming from sensible matter. The middle cell, cogitatio, takes the place of reason in brutes, allowing them geometrical reality and perception. The species in the imagination multiply themselves in the cognitive part, but the cognitive power possesses those species in a higher or nobler way, and the species of the estimative power exist in the cognitive power according to a nobler way of being than in the estimative power and memory. Therefore, the cogitative power uses all other powers as its instruments. And in humans, a rational power is added from without by an act of creation, and the rational soul is united primarily and immediately with the cogitative power, which it uses mainly as its own special instrument. The next sentence is important, and I cite it in Latin. Et habea fiant species in anima rationali, unde quando illa leditur, pervertitur maxime, judicium rationis, et quando illa est sana, tunc bene rationabiliter operator intellectus. David C. Lindbergh translates the first sentence as, and I quote, and species are produced in the rational soul by the cogitative faculty. I would prefer the following, and from or on the basis of the cogitative power, species in the rational soul are produced. The work of producing species in the rational soul of the human being is not the cogitative power alone, but it's the rational soul using the vis cogitativa as its special instrument. We will see below that this passage is very important in the Communia Naturalium, where Bacon addresses the anima intellectiva. And Bacon uses all of this stuff in the Perspectiva as a kind of analog to spell out how the anima intellectiva works. The important point to note here is that with the supervenience of the rational soul on the cogitative power in the human being, we have a fully united rational human being exercising administrative judgment while intimately united to the cogitative sense. There is no substance dualism here. There is one human being with the unity of the composite, and it's an intimate unity. But while the rational soul cannot have its species without the cooperation of the cogitative sense, the latter has, as it were, been aufgehoben, transcended into the unified rational soul, forming one substantial soul. Thus, for all his praise of Avicenna as the Dux Philosophorum after Aristotle, Bacon has transformed Avicenna's substance dualism into a non-dualist, human incarnate rational being. There's a gradual purification, as we saw, of the sense species, etc., etc. The human being, therefore, for Bacon, is an incarnate perspectivus. And so, when we talk about the emission of rays, we must include especially the visual rays. Bacon's combination of intromission and extramission isn't just of pure material species. The visual species count as the product of the human knower. Now, following the work of Carlos do Nascimento back in the 1980s or 70s, David C. Lindbergh did not allow in his treatment of the Perspectiva of spiritual species in Bacon. Yet Bacon does address the issue of spiritual species in the Communia Naturalium 1, Part 4, Distinction 3, Chapter 3. And you have the quotation there. when his discussion of Averroes on the unity of the intellect, that if there are numerous intellectual souls, then there will be numerous objects of the intellect. Bacon says this is insane because you can have the res intellectus, and you can have the species of the thing present before the soul. He goes on then, as you can see there, to use the multiplication of species, where he talks about we're receiving species according to all diameters, and yet seeing one thing from the multiplication of species, to say that we can, each person can have their own spiritual species, but basically they understand one thing. He talks then in regard to the notitia in complexorum. He says the species come to the intellect through the sense, and the agent intellect illustrates the species. And thus there is born in the soul a habitus cognitivus. And in this way, it's sufficient to have science in the disciple, such that science doesn't just, knowledge doesn't just generate itself. This reference to the intellectus agens is important. Some scholars have played it down in the scholarship, but Rega Wood, correctly, I believe, took it very seriously and notes its importance. And I agree with her in that respect. He goes on then to talk about the anima rationalis being the ultimate complement of the embryo of the human being, etc. And he talks about, it follows that there is a great error among those who argue, and because of this error and the cavillation, they kind of fictionalize a simple, rational, animate soul. Perhaps this is a reference to Thomas Aquinas. But my view at present is that there is one substance having diverse operations and diverse names and comparisons. As Aristotle wished when he said, intellectus speculativus per extensionem fit practicus. That which the theologians call reason and will, or intellect and effect, the philosophers call speculative and practical reason. Now, I don't want to go on reading the rest of the thing, but you can see from the long passage that comes that Bacon argues that the anima intellectiva non est allegata organo, and the human being's rational soul is not divided into parts, etc., etc. And he goes on to talk about the agias intelligentiae, and I'll just leave that there. Here we have Bacon's expression of his unitary but complex understanding of human knowledge, where the work of the perspectiva provides the natural perceptual basis for his understanding of the thinking, willing, and affective human being. Just as the perspectiva at the end of part 3 of the perspectiva provides a natural analog for the 8 Beatitudes based on the structure of the eye, and also the basis for the cooperation of human freedom and grace in terms of intromission and extromission. So we see Bacon mining the perspectiva for natural analogs to solve discussions on the unity of the intellect and the nature of the intellectual soul. And so we need to ask, did Bacon's own Franciscan Christian theological understanding affect the way in which he read his ancient Greek, his Latin and Muslim sources in the texts of the 1260s? I believe that it did. We noticed, however, that his position is directed against one famous one who held to the simplicity of the intellectual soul, and whose taught in Bacon's view was a narrow pessimus. And this places Bacon's concerns in the context of the teaching debates of the mid-1260s, leading to the condemnation of 1270 and 1277. And so we see that Bacon, the one who worked on the correction of the Bible in the Franciscan Studium, who had his own method, his new metaphysics, could not really avoid the debates of the masters of the sentences. He could not just stay out of the theological and philosophical debates. He kept butting into debate in an indirect way by working around his superiors and his Master General Bonaventure to appeal to Pope Clement IV directly for patronage, since the Opus Tertium is in fact a giant research grant application. It did not succeed. He was driven, however, to construct a new metaphysics, a new Philosophia Christiana, in which all the ancient traditions would be integrated into a new Baconian synthesis analogous to Thomas of York. Bacon is creatively, poetically rewriting what he taught Avicenna should have said or meant to say had he had access to Christian writings and a better understanding of the ancients. Conclusion. Bacon is one background player in the construction of a Neo-Augustinian Franciscan approach to philosophical development of theological themes, but he also stands out as a voice of those working on the biblical text who are quite annoyed at the prominence given to the masters of the sentences. His voice harks back to the days of Robert Grosseteste and Adam Marsh, and to the teaching methods using scripture as the primary text at Oxford. Bacon remains the great example in the 13th century of fruitful interaction between Oxford and